Welcome, welcome everyone. I'd like to ask you to join me in a short prayer as we call on the four directions, on the four corners of the world to come and be with us and to allow us to do our work together today. So if you would join me with your eyes closed, you're breathing deep. To the winds of the south, Sachamama, great serpent, mother of the waters, we call on you. Come and wrap your coils of light around us. Teach us your ways, the beauty way, to walk with beauty in the earth, to touch everyone we touch with beauty. Be with us. Ho! To the winds of the west, mother, sister, Jaguar, come to us. Come and walk among us. Teach us your ways of integrity, of impeccability. Teach us your ways of fearlessness, of walking beyond death. Be with us. Ho! To the winds of the north, grandmothers and grandfathers, ancient ones, guardians and keepers of this land. We come to honor you today, you who've walked here before us, and you who will come after us, our children's children. In your name we gather. Ho! To the winds of the east, the place of the rising sun, mother eagle, sister eagle, condor, we call on you. Hold us under your wing, mother. Hold us sweetly. Teach us your ways of flight, of sight. Be with us. Ho! Pachamama Santa Tierra, Mother Earth, thank you, Mother, for all of your sweet medicine, for your breath, your waters, to all our relations, the stone people, the plant people, the creepy crawlies, the winged, the furred, the finned, all our relations. Ho! Inti Taita, Father Sun, Grandmother Moon, to all the star nations, our star brothers and sisters, the sacred mountains of this earth, Anilia Tixi Kocha, Great Spirit, Creator of all, you who are known by 1,000 names, and you who are the unnameable one, you who sit above us and below us, you who sit in the north and the south and the east and the west, thank you for bringing us together today. Oh. So the shaman is the medicine woman, the medicine man, who mediates between the visible and the invisible worlds. The shaman is an individual from a traditional society who is the keeper of the cycles, who is the keeper of the sacred calendar, who takes part in the birth rites and the death rites and the great rites of passage of all the members of the village. The shaman has also been the seer, the visionary, the one who dreams the world into being, the one who casts the grappling hook way out into the future so that we can begin to inform ourselves by who we're becoming and not only by who we have been. And I believe that today we are the shamans. We are the ones that we've been waiting for. We are the new caretakers of the world. We are the new healers. We're the new myth makers. The shaman is a myth maker. The shaman is not a priest. The priest is the perpetuator of a myth that retells an event that occurred perhaps 2,000 years ago. The shaman is a myth maker, brings out the sacred in every moment, in every engagement. And we are the new shamans. We are the new caretakers of the earth. And I embarked on my study in shamanism nearly 30 years ago as a result of my frustration with Western psychology and really at my inability to discover the workings of the mind and particularly how we could create psychosomatic health. Because we knew that the mind could create psychosomatic disease. But could it create psychosomatic health? And of course, 25 years later, I'm convinced that the mind can only create psychosomatic disease because the mind is basically mad. So I began to study the techniques and methodologies and practices of the Earth peoples who had developed a body of knowledge for stepping beyond mind, for living mindfully, but not in the visceral grip of mind. And it led me to the Amazon, to the rainforests, and to study with medicine men and women who understood that we have a luminous energy field that surrounds the physical body, and that informs the physical body in the same way that the energy fields of a magnet organize iron filings on a piece of paper on top of it. And that whereas in the West we were intent on shuffling and moving the iron filings about, in the Americas, there was a body of energy healing practices that said, yes, we can shift the energetic and the body follows. We can work at the core, at the essential, and healing happens. And I found that these were traditions that had been neglected by anthropologists, by students of religion, because students of religion have studied the practices of and the teachings of the cultures that have left a written body of knowledge. And in the Americas, you find no writing. Writing is absent from the Americas, largely absent from the Americas. And we learned that if you did not know how to read or write, that you were illiterate and therefore not smart, not intelligent. So these traditions were dismissed, whereas students of religion and anthropologists have been studying the other world traditions, including Hinduism and Buddhism, that left the Vedas and the Sutras and the Quran and the Bible for hundreds of years. The indigenous practices of the Americas were neglected because they left no body of writing. And I'm convinced that the early Americans knew. They tracked forward into the future and they said, you know, if we develop writing, we're going to end up with attorneys in 1,500 years. So let's give it up altogether. Now, this is called preventive healing. Fixing things before they go wrong. And it's only been since the advent of Margaret Mead and other experiential anthropologists that we have begun to truly discover the wealth and the beauty of the indigenous teachings of our land, of the Americas. But these are traditions of the feminine earth. And they're very different from our traditions of the West, which are traditions of the masculine. They're traditions that we inherited from a Judeo-Christian heritage that is very focused on the masculine, is very patriarchal, is reductionistic, is atomistic. It's not holistic, it's not inclusive, it's not syncretic. These are traditions of the earth peoples, of the feminine. And in order to understand them, we have to understand a little bit more about our own traditions, particularly our own mythology. The mythology that shaped the reality that we live in today. Because mythology creates and informs reality. In fact, reality are really those myths that we haven't quite exposed yet or seen through yet. So let's take a brief look at our mythology. Do you know that we have the only mythology in the planet in which we were kicked out of the garden? That nobody else was cast out of the garden? The Aborigines were not kicked out of the garden. The sub-Saharan Africans, the indigenous Americans, they were given the garden to be the stewards and the caretakers of the garden. And not only that, as we're being cast out of, talk about having abandonment issues. Not only were we cast out of the garden, but as we're cast out, there's a voice that says, and cursed is the earth because of you. And you too, woman. And the same voice, I'm not making this up. You can look this up next time you stay in a motel. It's page 2. The same voice says to the man, and with the sweat of your back, you will take your food from the earth, and it shall grow thorns and thistles for you. Now, the voice didn't say, and the earth shall grow strawberries and mangoes and papayas for you. It said thorns and thistles. So this is our mythology. From the very start, the very beginning, we develop a hostile relationship with the feminine, curses the earth because of you, woman, and with the earth that will grow thorns and thistles for us. Right at the beginning. And then later on, we learn that matter is not spiritual. We learned that what's spiritual is not this physical matter, not this table here. That's not spiritual. And of course, where does the word matter come from? Remember your Latin? Mater, mother, maternal, maternity. We learned that the ways of the feminine, that the ways of the earth are not the ways of spirit. So our mythology it's a little bit funky, you know. It's a little bit of an unusual mythology that we have, because it biases very much towards and it's a wonderful mythology. It's produced science and technology and time-saving devices. But it's precluded us from the experience of communion, of union. It's chosen objectivity over subjectivity, over participatory experiences. The second element of our mythology that's unique is that we have practically the only mythology in the planet in which the masculine gives birth to the feminine. Do you remember that part? The rib? The rib. Nowhere else does the masculine give birth to anything. Except actually in Greek mythology, this appears as the ways of the feminine begin to be lost, and Zeus becomes the dominant god. Remember that in the early Greek mythologies, it was the creatrix, it was the goddess that was predominant. It was Hera, the goddess Hera, the 3-part goddess. And the temples to Hera were the temples to the creator. And then he began to be eclipsed by the masculine principle. But do you remember what Hera's men were called? Heroes. And what her followers were called? Heretics. And if you want to read the only Greek philosopher, they're tedious. But if you want to read the only Greek philosopher that speaks about the feminine, that is the Rumi of the Greeks, you have to read Heraclitus. Heraclitus. And then Zeus, of course, becomes the predominant principle, and he takes Hera for his bride, but Hera refuses to submit to him. And thereafter, she is known in the mythology as the bitch goddess. Because you cannot repress the feminine. You cannot. It becomes deadly for a culture. And this is what has happened to us. All of our paradigms of the West are the paradigms of the masculine. Our paradigms that say that, yes, all of the food on the planet belongs to us. Not to the other animals, not to the plants, but to us. That we can rape and loot and pillage and despoil the earth and postpone the price of cleanup to future generations. It's a mythology that has exhausted itself, a mythology of the masculine. And now we're looking for mythologies of sustainability, of collaborative relationships with the earth that have not emerged yet, that we're the ones who are birthing these mythologies, and that we have the traditions of the earth peoples to look to provide us models of the kind of world that our children's children can truly inhabit. So let's carry on with our mythology. We have another point that is rather unique to our traditions. which is that on the seventh day, all that was left was the naming of the plants and the animals. Now, physics picks up on this. Remember that mythology informs reality. Physics picks up on this and says, you know, on the 7th nanosecond after the Big Bang, all of the laws of physics were created. And all that was left was the naming of the unified field theory. The same mythology spilling over. Our mythology says that there's an independent evil principle in the universe. And then medicine picks up on this mythology and says, you know, the minute that you cut yourself, you have invisible microorganisms who are breeding and eating and having sex inside you. And the minute we break this protective membrane, that this predatory world will come and begin to feed on us. Now, for the shaman, it's interesting because shaman believes that we live in a benign universe. Evil exists, but only in the hearts of men and women. But that we live in a collaborative, benign universe that will actually go out of its way to conspire on your behalf. But you have to be in proper relationship with it. Because in the medicine traditions, in the shamanic traditions, the shaman believes that there's no difference in being killed by a microbe or being killed by a jaguar. They're identical. To us, one of them is an illness, and the other one is an accident. Poor Bobby went to the river at dusk, got eaten up. Terrible accident. For the shaman, they're identical. You have to be in proper relationship with microbes and with jaguars. Otherwise, they both begin to look at you as lunch. So that when you're not in proper relationship, the universe turns predatory. It begins to stalk you. If you were gotten out of bed in the morning and hit all the red lights on the way to work and thought maybe I should have stayed in bed, and at the end of the day, you realize you should have stayed in bed. You've tried to micromanage your entire day. Well, when we come out of proper relationship, we know how the universe responds to us, how it becomes adversarial, how we hit all the red lights, how we hit obstacle after obstacle. And when we're in proper relationship, we know how it conspires on our behalf, how we hit the green lights, how things line up, the most unlikely possibilities line up to make things work for us. So an essential aspect of the healing process in the medicine way is to come into proper relationship. Not to medicate, to treat, to intervene, but to come into proper relationship. And when we do, through energetic processes, then the universe lines up. Then our healing systems are disinhibited. Then the body can return to health. So our mythology informs science. And right now, we have been in the grip of a mythology that has exhausted itself. Our economics have exhausted themselves. Our political paradigms have exhausted themselves. Our relationship paradigms. We've come to the end of medicine. Do you know that what the third leading cause of death in the world is? In America, actually? Hospitals. The third leading cause of death. 26% of all staph infections are resistant to any kind of antibiotic. And if you look at the language that is used in our healing practices, the language of medicine, you find that we have the crusade against cancer, the battle against heart disease, that we have anti-cancer agents that target there, that we have antibiotics that destroy there. So it's a medical paradigm that is based on adversity, with the language of the battlefield, not in collaborative relationships with the body, but on adversity. We've come to the end of medicine. And the medicine of the future is energy medicine. It's our extraordinary capabilities that we have to create health, to maintain health, and to bring about health. And this is what the shaman has always done. This is the task of the shaman. It's the maintaining the health, the well-being, not just of the individual, but of the community, of the village, of the tribe, of the planet. Because in the medicine traditions, the ones that I was trained in, which is among the Inca, there's an understanding that we are born again and again, life after life after life. And part of the lore of the legends say that as we came into this very difficult time in history that we're living now, that there was a great angel who was reading the task ahead of us at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, and they said it was going to be difficult, challenging, extraordinary, extenuating circumstances, extraordinary presence and effort required to bring peace and healing into this time. Who would like to volunteer? And we said, me, us. So that each and every one of us in this room raised our hands because we didn't want to miss out on the party. We knew that we can make a difference at this time, that all of the prophecies of the indigenous people speak of the time of the great transformation. I love that scene in The Lord of the Rings where the little elf says, "No chance of success, certain death ahead of us? What are we waiting for?" And of course our odds are a little bit better than that. This is what we came to do. And this is what our work is here. And when I did the opening prayer for my talk, I called on 4 great archetypes, on the serpent, the jaguar, the hummingbird in the north, the condor, the eagle in the east. These are the 4 organizing principles in the medicine tradition. In the shaman's tradition, they're known by different names among the Hopi, among the Shoshone, among the Navajo, among the Mayan, among the Inca. But the important thing, of course, is not what you call it. Is it a jaguar in the west or a buffalo? The important thing is that when you call it, it comes. That's the essence, because that's the shaman's agreement with spirit. Our agreement with spirit that each and every one of you has signed up for. Our agreement with spirit is that when you call, spirit comes. Not 60% of the time, not 90% of the time, not 99% of the time, 100% of the time. You call, spirit answers. Pretty cool agreement, huh? But remember the fine print in the back? You didn't read that part, did you? Before you signed. Remember the fine print? What did the fine print say? Spirit calls, you answer. Spirit calls, not 90% of the time, not 99%, 100% of the time. Spirit calls, we answer. We don't go, you know, Spirit, my 401k isn't fully funded yet. Or, maybe when I finish the New York Times crossword puzzle on Saturday, I'll say yes. No, Spirit calls and we respond. We answer, we're there, we're present, we show up. And these 4 great archetypes that we summoned are the embodiment of 4 organizing principles in nature that have been recognized by every culture and every tradition. For example, when we call on the spirit of Jaguar, the spirit of Jaguar, let me describe it to you from the Western point of view. The spirit of Jaguar is not only a great archetype, but is also a law of nature. In the West, we know it as the second law of thermodynamics. Remember the second law of thermodynamics? It's the law of entropy. And remember what the law of entropy says? The law of entropy basically is the law that says that there are no free lunches. It's the law that says that everything in the universe is tending to chaos. It's the law that says that all of the poop is going to hit the fan. Which is the reason why we carry day planners. So we can schedule it for when we want it to hit the fan. You don't need to have gone to Oxford to figure this out. Basically, you just need to get out of bed in the morning. And you know that it's already going to hell. This is the way the physical universe operates. The law of entropy. Ice will melt into a puddle of water, will evaporate into a gas. Everything in the physical universe seeks expansion, chaos. You've got to keep maintaining your house. The damn toilet is still leaking. Entropy. It operates, it touches every aspect of our lives. Recognized by every great tradition in the world. Shamans call it Jaguar. But the medicine people recognized that life was anti-entropic, that life defied entropy, that life didn't seek chaos. Life sought beauty and complexity and order. That you have organelles teaming with each other to form cells, that team with each other to form tissue, that team with each other to form organs, that get together with others to create eagles. Life seeks beauty, complexity. Life is anti-entropic. The shamans of old called it Jaguar. They recognized that it was the same life-death principle, the entropic, anti-entropic principle, and they called it Jaguar. The difference being that we can't get up and go, yo, second law of thermodynamics, come to me. Because we're not going to get anything. But we can go, Mother, Sister, Jaguar, come to me. Help bring beauty and order out of chaos. Help this little one who's cancer-ridden, this chaotic spread of cancer through her body. Help bring order out of chaos. Or help bring a little bit of chaos and renewal into this family or into this person's life who's stuck, who's paralyzed. Mother, Sister, Jaguar, come into this person and teach her how to reinvent and renew herself. Bring a little bit of disorder, renewal. So the shaman has an animistic relationship with life, with all of even with the laws of physics. Remember that animism is what's practiced by people that believe that they can speak to the rivers and to the trees and to the canyons and to the mountains and to God. Now, this is what we were able to do before we were cast out of the garden. We could still speak to the rivers, to the trees, to nature, to God. So what we're up to today is a grand kind of soul retrieval, where we're retrieving that self that still walks with beauty on the earth, that still speaks to the rivers and to the trees and to the clouds and to God and to whom the rivers and the trees and the voice of spirit talks back to. See, spirit is actually talking to us all the time. It's just that we don't open our ears to hear. In the medicine way, what this involves is a reclaiming, it's a soul retrieval of reclaiming that self that still walks with beauty on the earth. In fact, one of the most heathen of all ceremonies and pagan of all ceremonies that the shamans do. This is from the perspective of the church. And I was drawn to work in Peru. The reason that I ended up working with the Incas after spending time with Rolling Thunder in North America and the Shoshone and some of the Hopi, I realized that in North America, the indigenous peoples had been in reservations for 150 years. The largest group were the Navajo with 300,000 members. When I got to Peru, I found that there were 26 million people in the country, and 25 million of them were Indians, and it was the white people that lived in reservations in their cities. But what really attracted me to the Inca traditions, and they are the same throughout the Americas. At their core, at their essence, they're the same. The details vary, but the essence is identical, is that in Peru was the last remaining office of the Inquisition. Now, I thought the Inquisition had shut its offices down in the 1600s, but it had kept one open. Still run by the Dominicans, which were the ones who sentenced Joan of Arc to burn at the stake. And it's called the Office for the Extirpation of Idolatries. This is the last thriving Mecca of unconverted people in the world. And it had an office of the Inquisition. I said, if it's good enough for the church, it's good enough for me. I'm going to go and study with the indigenous peoples there. And I spent 25 years, first as a medical anthropologist and a psychologist, and then becoming a student of the shamans, immersing myself in the ways of the shaman. So the nature of the dialogue that the shaman has with nature is one of life speaking to life, life connecting with life, and life responding to a call and responding to life, responding to us. So each one of the 4 archetypes that we work with are the embodiment of one of the organizing principles of the universe, except that they're described in an animistic fashion, in a way that you can relate to the spirit of that jaguar. And each one of them represents each one of the directions, one of the steps that the shaman goes through to become a man or a woman of knowledge. Because the shaman differentiates between information and knowledge. Information is what we're flooded in every day. Knowledge is wisdom. Information is knowing that water is H2O. Knowledge is being able to make it rain. Information is knowing someone's diagnosis. I remember looking through a medical text one time and being astonished at how many different ways there were of being ill. And if you discover a new way of being ill, you become famous. You get to put your name on it. But there are very few ways of being healthy, and no one had ever described what those were. So the fact that we can describe it, that we can say it's H2O, doesn't mean that we can make it rain. And in the shamanic traditions, the shaman doesn't diagnose. The shaman heals. There's no diagnosis. There's healing. Understanding follows healing rather than preceding healing, rather than coming before, rather than my going, when I was 10 years old, my father wasn't around for a long time, and I've been looking for an image of the masculine my entire life since, and I better go into therapy. Which may or may not be true. It's not the case, but we need to understand what went wrong before we decide to try to fix it. Now, the problem with that is that we end up with a solution that's exactly the size of the problem. And the problem that we define is always too small. So the shaman always seeks a spiritual solution to a presenting problem. Always understands that the problem is really not the problem. That the problem is much vaster than what hurts. And that the solution is much greater than fixing what may be hurting. The shaman finds a spiritual solution to every condition. And the shaman learns that there are 4 levels of engagement. In fact, my work today is to train Western shamans. In our healing school, we have a healing school that's based here in California and in the East Coast. And we train modern shamans. We don't train people to become Indians, but we train individuals who can mediate between heaven and earth, who know the journey beyond death, who are able to practice healing at an essential level, at the energetic level, at the level of the luminous energy field. And they can clear an imprint of disease from the blueprint so that it doesn't organize the body into illness. And we differentiate between healing and curing. See, curing is a business of medicine. Healing is our business. It's the business that we're in. And we all know people who have been cured, who've had the tissue removed, who've had the tumor removed, but who have not been healed, who still have the same toxic relationships, who still are in the same toxic job, the kids don't talk to them, who haven't changed their diet, they've gone through a cure, but there's been no healing. And when the blueprint isn't cleared, you can remove the tissue as often as you want, but disease will reorganize itself. We're in the business of healing. And most of the time, healing also results in a cure. But healing is transformative. Healing is founded on an experience of infinity. Healing occurs at the energetic. Let me describe to you the 4 levels, the 4 domains that we work with, which are the 4 domains of engagement of the shaman. The first one is the literal world, the physical world. This is the world that we're most familiar with. This is the world of objects and facts, of tables, of chairs, of cars, of bodies, of molecular structures, of medication, of the literal, the physical. And it's helpful to imagine these like Russian nesting dolls. You know these dolls that nest within each other? And that the outer layers inform the inner ones. So the level of the literal of the body, and enveloping that is the mind. It's the level of mind of the symbolic. And enveloping that is the domain, the level of the soul. And enveloping that is the level of spirit. So we know the mind informs the body. We know the soul informs the mind. We know the spirit informs the soul, informs the mind, informs the body. And each one of these levels or domains has its own language. For example, the language of the literal, of matter, is a molecular, a chemical language of atoms and protons and electrons and molecules. The language of mind is words. The language of the soul are images, and we're still hunters and gatherers of images. And the language of spirit is energy. The language of spirit is energy. And you cannot take the language of one domain into the other. So for example, I can ask you all to raise your hands. Please raise your hand. Okay, you can bring your hand down. And now please raise your blood pressure. It's harder to do. You can't go blood pressure go up, which is why visualization is so much more powerful than affirmations. Because you're engaging deeper structures of the psyche. Visualization, imagery works at the domain of the soul, at the domain of the sacred, whereas affirmations work at the domain of the mind. But if I were to show you images, if I were to project here images from my last trip to Brazil, I was on book tour in Brazil when Shaman Healer Sage came out. And I brought back some Brazilians are the most beautiful people, beautiful men, beautiful women, and they have these bathing suits there that they call dental floss. Have you seen those? If I were to show you images of these bathing suits, your blood pressure would go up if you still have a pulse. So that images inform domains, regions of the brain that words can't get to. And the language of the shaman is the language of the sacred. It's the language of the soul. It's the language of images, of candles, of drums, but underlying that even is the language of the energetic. It's the language of the energetic. I remember when I was first doing my field research in the Andes, I would take a movie camera with me, and I'd be filming the medicine people doing healing. And the young medicine people were fantastic because they would have their altars and the feathers and the rattles and the stones, and they would be going, Haturapu Pachamama, beautiful, exquisite. And then one of the old people would do healing, and I'd be filming this. One of the old people would come and they would go, and I go, would you mind doing that again so I can get, they go. Because they could pack so much consciousness into such little energy, and the really good ones didn't even need to lift their finger. They worked so at the essential level, at the energetic, that they needed no form anymore. But of course it took many, many, many decades of mastery to get that, because I can point my finger as much as I want. And so the closer you work to the essential, the less matter that there is, the more consciousness that you pack into energy, the more transformative it is. And the gift of the shaman is the gift of shifting between levels. So that if you have a pending engagement with a heart condition, because a heart condition runs in your family, because your mother died of heart disease, your grandmother died of heart disease, you don't want to have that engagement at the literal, at the ER. You preferably will have that at the level of mind, where mind-body medicine can help you heal the body, or even better, at the mythic domain. And ideally at the essential, at the energetic, where you can clear an imprint from your luminous energy field that predisposes you to that condition before it manifests. Or if it is already manifested, in the clearing of that blueprint, you can disinhibit the body's own natural healing systems. So this is the gift of the shaman, to shift levels of engagement. And it can work the other way around as well. I have a client of mine who's been carrying a book within her, inside her, for years. And she's been wanting to birth this book. And she had been carrying it in the mythic. In her soul, she knew that she had a book inside her. And our work together was to bring this book from potential, from its seed form, into its expression, into the literal. If you go into the Navajo territory, the Navajo medicine women, and some of the old ones still remember how to do this, will do sand paintings on the desert floor. You ever seen the Navajo sand paintings? They'll take different colored sands and they'll sprinkle them on the desert floor. And when they've made an accurate enough representation of their client that they're healing, they can shift something in the sand painting and it'll change in the client. They're working at the mythic, at the level of images. Now, a voodoo doctor will do the same thing with a doll, with their victim that they're intending to harm. When it's an accurate enough representation, they'll be able to. The Tibetan monks that you see traveling around the world today that are doing mandalas on the floor in cities, they're making a representation of the energy of that city, and they're shifting the mandala at the mythic, at the level of soul, so that healing is brought at the literal level to these cities. They're not doing street art. And of course, the language of the essential is energy. That's the only language spoken there. And for us, the reality exists in the upper two levels, at the literal and of the mind. And in traditional society, reality exists at the energetic and at the mythic, which is the domain of the sacred, of the soul, of ceremony, of rites of passage. This is where spiritual life resides. This is what the shaman does. The shaman comes and maps at the mythic level and intervenes at the energetic. Whereas we tend to map at the mental level, these are the psychological problems that are going on, and then we intervene at the literal. Let's change this. Let's try this behavior. Let's try this belief system. Let's try changing our lives in this way. Let's go shopping. The shaman, I went to my mentor. I was very fortunate right almost from the beginning, to meet a man who became my mentor. He was one of the last Inca, and part of a community of people that had fled to the high mountains at the time of the conquest to escape the church. And they have had no contact for the last 500 years with the West. Absolutely no contact. And I was the first American anthropologist to have any contact with him. And he took me under his wing, and I remember going with him one time we were traveling high in the Andes. We would walk from village to village, and we were having this discussion, a bit of an argument. I was saying to him, well, in the West, when we have a problem, we turn it over to spirit. We pray to God. We turn it over to spirit. And he said, that doesn't work. He said, what we do is we turn it over to the earth, to the mother. Our mother wants us to be well. We turn it over to the mother. said, nope, we pray to God. We turn it over to spirit, up. I said, down. So we came to this village, and as we're entering into this village, there's a pile of horse manure. And he says to me, dig a hole here. I dig a small hole. He asked me to bring half of that manure over and to put it in the hole and cover it up. And the other half he has me put on top of a stone, of a large stone about my height. Doesn't say a word. And we head off. 10 days later, we come back to the same village. I had forgotten about this incident completely. And he takes me back to where we buried the horse manure. He says to me, dig. And I begin to dig it. And he says, see, it's already turning back to life. It's turning into fertilizer. He takes me to the rock and he says, see, still looks like shit, doesn't it? Still smells like poop. So the directionality in the traditions of the earth peoples are one of engaging the processes of the earth, inhabiting our bodies, relating to the mother, reclaiming the feminine, and coming into balance between heaven and earth, reclaiming that which we have been disowned from in our heritage. So I went to him one time and I said, it's happened again. And in my late 20s, I was suffering from a common condition that many of you recognize. I was suffering from chronic heartbreak. And I go to him and I said, it's happened again. You won't believe this. And he says to me, I'm not interested. And I said, but my heart's breaking. I'm in pain. And he says, I'm not interested. Come back with an interesting story. And because in the shamanic teaching, the healing process has to do with dropping the story, disidentifying from the story, dropping the story. But it's not an intellectual process. You don't just drop the story. You do it energetically. Not a mental process. It's a ceremonial. It's a sacred process. He says, come back with something interesting, he says. I come back a couple of days later with something with a bigger story. And he says, no, Alberto, your problem is that you're being stalked by an eagle. And it's going to kill you unless you tame it. Unless you receive its wisdom and its power, it's going to destroy you. And come, I will heal you. And he comes over, he takes his rattle, shakes his rattle over me, and blows into the top of my head. And I said, what did you do? He said, I told the eagle where you live. I said, thanks very much. And from that moment on, this eagle began to haunt me in the dream time. And it was a year and a half before I received the gifts of rising above the dilemmas in my own life, of perspective, of vision, of clarity, of soaring. And it ended my heartbreak. So he took what was a psychological map that I brought to him at the second level of mind, and he dropped it down to the level of the sacred, to a sacred engagement, which doesn't mean that when you go back home, you start telling all your clients you have an eagle stalking you. This is an example of a sacred engagement, of a mythic engagement. And this is what our lives are about. They're mythic journeys. Because the shaman understands that we're not the product exclusively of who we have been, that we are the product of who we are becoming, that we are compelled and called by the future, not just pushed by the past, that we can break free of the stories that we carry, that we are not our stories. In fact, this is the 4 healing practices that we teach our students in our teaching model that are ancient healing practices. The first one is the illumination process, how to clear imprints from the luminous energy field and overwrite them with light so that they no longer spill over and claim our present. Joseph Campbell said to me once, we were having dinner many, many years ago, and he said to me once, we'd had a glass of wine or two, and he said to me, Alberto, if you don't learn it, you end up marrying it. And many of us do, many of us did and do. And when you clear an imprint from the luminous energy field, you break free of the repeating behavior patterns that keep us dating, marrying, ending up with the same jobs, the same spouses. I have a friend of mine that sent me a wedding invitation recently. I got it in the mail, and it was an invitation to his 5th wedding. And I call him up and I said, "Do you remember what you asked me to do to you if you were ever getting married again?" He said, "No, Alberto, this is different. It's different this time." And I met her, said, "You've got to meet her." And I met her, very wonderful woman, but she was just a brunette version of the last one. And I said to him, "You've got to stop looking for the right partner, and you've got to become the right partner. You've got to heal, or you're going to continue in the same." We drop the story. We're no longer the story, but we drop it energetically. We don't just go, "I'm not my history, I'm not my stories, I know that, I'm going to drop the story." Well, welcome to the new story. My story's now that I've dropped the story. It has to be at the essential level. It cannot be at the level of mind, because it's the madness of the mind, again, contaminating the well. It has to be at the level of the sacred. It has to be a sacred experience. So there are 4 core healing practices. The first one is the illumination process, clearing and overwriting imprints. Many of them are karmic. Some of them we inherited from our parents. They're what they call in the jungle ancestral curses that are passed down from one generation to the other, that a mother may pass on to a daughter, that a father may pass on to a son, in the hopes that perhaps they will heal them for the things that they were unable to heal. Some of them are genetic, predispositions to certain physical conditions. And some of them may come from very, very early life, intrauterine, and even, in many cases, our former existences, the karma that we bring with us into this life. The illumination process. The second one is the extraction process. The extraction process is a method for extracting energies that do not belong to us. Because we assume in the West that all of the energies that we carry within us belong to us. And that is not the case. That's not the case. So we learn how to work with intrusive energies and entities, which are not very common, but they happen. When Shaman Healer Sage, my last book, was about to be released, the Random House flew me to New York. And to pitch the book to their top salespeople. There are 25 top salespeople that sell to Barnes & Nobles and the big chains, and I had 10 minutes. They weren't interested in Shaman, Healer, anything. They wanted a Mars and Venus book. And it was after lunch. They're falling asleep, and this man walks into the room, and he raises his hand, and he addresses the group instead of me. And he says, you all know I ordinarily do not come to these meetings. And you know as well that I've had a problem with alcohol for the last 10 years. And I want you to know I went to see one of Dr. Villoldo's graduates. That was 3 months ago. I've not had a drop of alcohol, and I've lost my craving to drink. This stuff really works. Thank you very much. He gets up and leaves, and I have no idea who this man is. It turns out that he was my editor's boss's boss's boss, one of the heads of the Random House. And now suddenly everybody's interested, because everybody in publishing in New York has a problem with alcohol. And I'm wondering what went on, because addictions are very complex things to deal with. And I call our graduate right after our talk, and she says to me, well, this man pulled up to my office. His chauffeur was outside. He was outside in the big white limo, walks into my office, and walking in right behind him was his father's spirit. His father had died 10 years earlier and had been an alcoholic all his life. And I asked her, what did you do? She said to me, I helped him to die. I helped him to die. She did an extraction. Helped him to die, to make his way back consciously to the world of spirit, and then he could stop drinking. Extraction process. extraordinarily powerful. There's no amount of psychotherapy that will help you get rid of Uncle Harvey if he's attached himself to you. And when we're dealing with intrusive entities, we're most often dealing with relatives that may die unconsciously and then gravitate to the closest blood relative and who is most psychically open. Seeking help, seeking assistance, caught between this world and the next in a nightmare that they can't wake up from. They'll gravitate to the closest relative. And oftentimes, there are past lives of ours that have been awakened from the unconscious that begin to haunt us. So the extraction process is the most effective way of addressing these energies that do not belong to us. But sometimes they're simply energies. They're simply energies that someone that we once cared for is directing to us. Do you remember that boy that proposed to you when you were 19? And he came up and he said, "Would you marry me?" And you said, "No, let's just be friends." You were so flattered. And he said, "Okay." The bitch. She's ruined my life. This is a fellow that I'm making all this up, but this fellow that you dated, you were close to, and he had been practicing in front of the mirror for 3 weeks. Please marry me, please. And you say, "No, let's just be friends." And you've just ruined his life. In fact, he's still thinking about you 30 years later, and 2 children. So, and we all have individuals that feel that in some way we may have betrayed them, we may have ruined their lives. You did not say, you said, "Let's be friends." You were flattered, and his life was. Individuals who now are beginning to direct a negativity and anger, dislike, a hatred towards us that penetrates our luminous energy field and can become incredibly toxic. Individuals that we had no resistance for because we had this completely open lines to them in the past. And these energies can embed themselves in the body and become crystallized and become quite toxic. And if they embed themselves in a particular organ or system or endocrine gland, they can trigger and accelerate a disease process. Intrusive energies, the extraction process, ancient process practiced throughout the world. The third process the third core shamanic healing practice is the soul retrieval process. And soul retrieval has to do with recovering a part of ourselves that has splintered off as a result of pain or trauma. Retrieving a soul part that is splintered. Now, this pain and trauma may have occurred 2,000 years ago or 20 years ago. And when we recover the soul lost part, we're able to become whole again. The shaman does this through journeying, through the process of journeying, through entering an altered state and tracking along a client's timeline or your own timeline to find an event that occurred in the past that created a disassociation, a splitting of the self, and then coaxing and bringing that soul part back. Sometimes the soul part will say to you, "Why should I come back? I mean, look at her life. She says she wants to play more, to have more fun, to have more love in her life. She has no time. Why should," and gives you a laundry list, a to-do list that you bring back for your client. We retrieve a soul part and a power animal, which is the instinctual part of the self that helps us to reset our instinct, to reclaim our instinct. Soul retrieval accomplishes in a few sessions what can take years to do in therapy because you're working at the level of the essential, of the energetic. You're recovering a soul part that has been deeply wounded by tracking to that original wound. See, when a client comes to see me, they usually want to talk about the most recent time that it hurt. And what I'm interested in doing in soul retrieval is finding the original time that wounding occurred, tracking back along their timeline to find an original wound where we can intervene. Not in version number 37, which is the one that's hurting right now, but the original one. We find the original wound, we find the contracts that were entered into during the time of that wounding, because there's always a contract that is entered into. I had a woman who came to see me, and her original wounding was early life abuse. And the contract that she made was, if I'm a nice girl, daddy won't hurt me. Now, this is a contract that a 6-year-old will word. But that contract that she still carried with her to her early 40s kept drawing her to abusive men, an abusive marriage with men that continued to hurt her. So she had to disassemble that contract. During soul retrieval, we also go to recover our original contract, the one that you made with spirit before you were born. That contract, that agreement that you made with spirit before you were born about what your journey in this life was going to be like. What you came here to learn, what you came here to explore, what you came here to discover, how you came here to love, how you came here to serve. Recovering that original agreement that you made with spirit, with yourself. The soul retrieval process. During the soul retrieval process, we're not only able to journey back along a timeline, we're also able to journey forward along a timeline to practice, in effect, what we call destiny retrieval, where we can access a future healed state that can begin to inform who we are today. I had a client come to see me who is a physicist at Stanford University at the Linear Accelerator. I had met him earlier in a conference, and they were investigating what happened in the third nanosecond after the Big Bang, the big linear accelerator, to see if there was enough matter in the universe for it to continue to expand for eternity, or if it was going to begin to contract in a reverse kind of Big Bang, in which case, we had some planning to do, because... So he calls me 6 months later, and I asked Steve, what's the verdict for the universe? Are we going to make it? So I wanted to stop worrying about this, just get this over with. And he said, no, it looks good for the universe. Looks like there's enough matter in it to continue expanding indefinitely, but it doesn't look good for me. I've just been diagnosed with a very aggressive form of cancer. 98% of the people who get this at the late stage that I have die within 4 months. He was a research scientist. He'd done his research. He was also raising 2 young daughters by himself, and he had met the woman that was the love of his life. They were to be married 8 months later. And he had just been handed a death sentence. I met with Steve, and we worked in tracking a healed destiny. We had to slip through that 2% window to find a healed state that could begin to inform the present. So he was no longer informed exclusively by his genes, so he was no longer informed exclusively by his disease. He could be informed by his health in a future healed state that, when we identified it, was able to lock into the moment to become his destiny and lead him to health. I married him and his wife 8 months later. And he, of course, had to leave. He had to leave Stanford. He had to leave the fast track in physics. He moved to Alaska and became a wood carver. A live wood carver, a happy wood carver, an in love wood carver. This is what a group of Hopi and Inca medicine people do. They sit in meditation. Elders of all traditional cultures sit in meditation, envisioning the possible world that they want their children's children to inherit. Not the probable world, not the 98% world. Steve had gone to see a number of psychics who tracked along his future destiny lines, and they all said dead, 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 dead. Almost dead. Because 98% of his destinies lay within that tunnel, and only 2% were outside of, and out of that 2%, only a small fraction of his destiny lines contain health. This is the same thing that a group of Inca and Hopi elders do, and others, and Mayans and Shoshone, and is to dream the possible world into being. Not the probable world, but the possible world, no matter how improbable. And in the act of dreaming it, they're making it a little bit more possible, more probable. Destiny tracking. Because time and effect does not run linearly like we've experienced it. And as part of the training in the medicine way, we learn to step outside of ordinary time, of the time that flies like an arrow, that shoots like an arrow, where the future is always ahead of us, the past is behind us. We learn to step out of the time that flies like an arrow into time that turns like a wheel, that's polychronic, that is not monochronic. Because the problem with time that flies like an arrow is that it breeds psychotherapists. Because the main operating principle of that time is causality, is cause and effect, that says that who we are today is the result of something that happened to us when we were 12, or something that happened to us when we were 4, or something that happened to us in a previous life. Causality is the main operating principle of this time, whereas sacred time that turns like a wheel, the main operating principle is synchronicity. You can influence events that occurred in the past. You can nudge destiny. Larry Dawsey probably spoke to you about the studies that were done on retroactive intercessory healing. Did he speak about that? Oh, not yet. Well, I'm not going to mention a thing then. But he may speak about studies that show you how events in the past are influenced, how healing can take place for conditions that occurred 10 years earlier. And what the shaman discovers is that time runs in figure eights, that it loops and wormholes back and forth into itself, that we can nudge destiny, that we can influence events that occurred in the past. But the way that we experience that is by breaking free of time, by breaking free of the grip of time, by experiencing infinity. And the core healing practice of the medicine way, the illumination process, happens outside of time. It happens in infinity. It happens when we access a self that never entered the stream of time, that cannot be affected by disease, that cannot be touched by ill health. And then we can reinform who we are today. We can grow new bodies that age differently, that heal differently, that die differently. And the fourth core healing practice are the great rites of passage, the great rites of passage, that include the birth rites, that include the death rites, that include the rites of passage at different points in our lives that we have lost in the West. We've forgotten the birth rites. We've forgotten the death rites. We no longer remember how to sit with a loved one as they're making their most extraordinary journey that they will ever make, to assist them in disengaging their luminous energy field so that their physical body can break free of, their luminous body can break free of the physical body and make its journey home. So the shaman learns the way back home, back to the spirit world now. Now, while we still have a body to come back to, because you don't want to be asking for directions when you're making your final crossing. It's not a good idea. So the shaman learns the way back home now, learns the journey beyond death, learns to step beyond death, to no longer be haunted by death. So you can sit with a loved one in the middle of that storm of the senses collapsing and be an island of peace in the middle of a storm. So the great rites of passage, essential, not only the birth rites and the death rites, but the great transition rites. My little girl came back from a trip to the East Coast, And when she arrived at LAX, she comes out of the airplane and she goes, she was 11, no, she was 9. She goes, "Look, Daddy, I got a bra." And I go, "Great, sweetie, would you mind showing me later?" And she said, "No, Daddy, you got to see it now." Everybody was looking at me, and this is such a wonderful time for her. But we have forgotten the rites. We don't have them in the West. In a traditional culture, she would have been welcomed into the society of women. Remember your rites of passage into womanhood? Yeah. You got the talk. Or into manhood. Your rites of passage into manhood from boyhood, where you got a driver's license and bought a six-pack. Into womanhood, we have lost these great rites of initiation that welcome young men into manhood, into adulthood. That's why for so many of us men, our growth is stunted at that early stage, that we were never able to step fully into manhood, into fatherhood, into adulthood. And for women, the same. So the rites of passage celebrate these great moments of transition, of being welcomed by other women into the society of women. The rites of menopause, of being welcomed into the sage stage of your life, into the wisdom keeper stage, the storyteller, the woman who can wear purple now and drive a Corvette. You're free. This is a great liberating. You're free from the grip of biology. What a celebration. And we've lost them, of course, in the West. So the great rites of passage, the great rites of initiation, including the death rites. And there's no more important gift that you will give a loved one than to assist them in their journey into the beyond, their journey into who they are becoming. And I encourage you, in Shaman Healer Sage, the last chapter of the book is dedicated to the death rites, which are the birth rites into the spirit world. You can do this at home. And you will be called upon to do it at home. And hopefully when our time comes, we will be with someone who knows the way back home, who can sit with us, who can hold our hand, who can talk us through into the light. So while the shaman comes from a traditional culture, my mentor, my teacher believed that the new shamans, that the new caretakers from the earth would come from the West, that they would be us, that we are the stewards of our planet, that we are the ones who can bring healing and transformation to our families, to our communities, to our villages, to the earth, and that this is a critical time in history, that all of the prophecies of the indigenous peoples speak about. This time approaching 2012, each one of these years with a theme. The theme of this year is a reawakening of the earth and of our own feminine, of our own earth. A time of tremendous transformation for the planet, when all of our old models of sustainability, of ecology, of marriage, of aging, we don't want to age the way that our parents did. We want to take our vitality, our sexuality, our humor, our spirituality with us into our later years. We're reinventing every facet of society. And we are the change agents. And that's who the shaman has always been. So the medicine way is a way that is as contemporary today as it was 50,000 years ago, as it was 100,000 years ago. Because a shaman is a map maker. We're map makers. I have a friend of mine that collects maps. He collects spiritual maps. He has Hindu maps and Buddhist maps and Christian maps and shamanic maps and tantric maps and Kama Sutra maps and Christian maps. And I've asked him one time, have you ever walked any of these landscapes? He said, no, I just collect the maps. And we're map makers. We're map makers. The maps that the shaman has to the journey beyond death, essential maps. But we remember, of course, that the map is not the territory. The map is only the guide to the territory. And the shaman eventually makes her own maps. You make your own maps. For example, the maps that we have in the West to the journey beyond death are maps that have been provided to us by people who've had a near-death experience. So they've been mapped, this landscape beyond death, and there's a wonderful body of near-death literature that shows the journey back to the light. Unfortunately, it's been mapped by people that have only been there for 3.5 minutes. I mean, if you're going to New York City, you don't want to map by somebody who's been there for 3.5 minutes. Not if you want to find any of the good restaurants. And these are very recent maps too, because a near-death experience is an entirely new phenomena because of medical technology. 50 years ago, if you had a near-death experience, you died. There was no resuscitating on the operator. There was no resuscitating you on the... So the maps that have been drawn by the Tibetans, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, extraordinary maps to the beyond. The shamanic maps by people who have journeyed, who journey freely, who step beyond death. Because the shaman is a person of the percept. We're people of the percept. The shamans are people of the percept. They have perceptual traditions. Perceptual traditions. They want to change the world. They shift their perception about it. You shift your perception, you dream the world into being, and the world changes. Whereas in the West, we're people of the precept. We get precepts. We get laws. We get rules. We get 10 commandments. We elect legislators. We elect lawmakers that make more rules. Have you ever heard of Congress getting together and saying, you know, we've got too many laws? We're people of the precept. The Greeks were people of the concept. They didn't get rules, they got ideas, and they understood that there was nothing as powerful as an idea whose time had come. The shamans are people of the percept. They seldom ever work with rules, they don't diagnose, they seldom ever engage in the cognitive, but if they want to change the world, they dream the world into being. They dream the sacred dream. They dream the dream of our children's children. They dream of sustainability, of peace, and they practice that dream. They embody that dream. They become that dream. These are people for whom the dream time has not been stuffed into the domain of sleep like it has for us. And that's our task today, is to dream with our eyes open. I remember traveling with my mentor high in the Andes one time, and we came to a village where it hadn't rained in many, many months, and the high mountain lagoons were beginning to dry. And they said to him, please, would you call the rain for us? And he went into a hut, meditated for 4 days, came out, and I asked him where he was going, and he was going to the edge of the mountain. We were very high up. And I said, what are you going to do? He said, I'm going to go and pray rain. And he was always correcting me and telling me how much information I had and how little knowledge I really carried. So every chance that I had to correct him, I would. I said, no, you mean you're going to go and pray for rain? He said, no, I'm going to go and pray rain. And he came back 3 hours later, and the sky was dark with clouds, great big thunderheads, and the rains broke out. And everybody said, thank you, thank you, thank you, you made it rain. And he said, no, it rained. It rained. And it was such a beautiful teaching to me, because as he was walking out, he pointed out to me, I'm going to go and pray rain, because the shaman lives in a non-dual universe. There's no one to pray to, and there's no one to pray for. So he went out and he prayed rain. And when he came back, he said, it rained. He was as surprised as anybody else. There was no me in the equation to make it rain. There was no me in the equation any longer. There was no I to make it rain. And there was also no I to get wet. And we all celebrated that day. And that's our task today. Our task today is to pray peace. It's to pray peace, to become peace, to practice peace, and to dream our world into being. Thank you very much for coming today. Walk in beauty, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.